late as 1974, some FBI officials took the position that the Bureau's counter-espionage activities were not under the authority of the Attorney General, since the FBI was accountable in this area directly to the United States Intelligence Board and the National Security Council. A Justice Department committee chaired by Assistant Attorney General Henry Peterson sharply rejected this view and declared, "There can be no doubt in the area of foreign counterintelligence, as in all its other functions, the FBI is subject to the power and authority of the Attorney General." Footnote 27b. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 27b. Report of the Peterson Committee on COINTELPRO, pages 34 to 35. The committee was especially concerned that the ad hoc equivalent of the U.S. Intelligence Board had approved the discredited, quote, Houston Plan, end quote, in 1970. However, the committee complied with the FBI's request that it excluded from its review of domestic COINTELPRO activities the Bureau's, quote, extremely sensitive foreign intelligence collection techniques, end quote. Memorandum from FBI Director Kelly to Acting Attorney General Robert Bork, December 11, 73. Resuming the reading. In recent years, the FBI has taken steps to upgrade its counter-espionage effort, which had been neglected because of the higher priority given to domestic intelligence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Footnote 27c. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 27c. C. D. Brennan Testimony Hearings, Volume 2, page 117. Resuming the reading. New career development and mid-career training programs have been instituted. FBI agents specializing in counter-espionage begin their careers as criminal investigators and not as analysts, and Bureau officials stress that their role is accurate fact-finding rather than evaluation. Nevertheless, counter-espionage supervisory personnel have recently attended high-level training courses in foreign affairs and area studies outside the Bureau. Footnote 27d. Reading footnote 27d. W.R. Wanal Testimony, January 21st, 76, pages 18 to 22. Resuming the reading. Here, then, are the key elements of counter-espionage. Together they combine into a discipline of great importance, for the rock-bottom obligation of an intelligence service is to defend the country. Meeting this obligation is the very raison d'etre of counterintelligence. The discipline also represents the most secret of secret intelligence activities, the heart of the onion. Its great importance and its ultra-secrecy make counterintelligence an area of concern that cannot be ignored by policymakers and by those responsible for legislative oversight. As a review of current issues in counterintelligence attests, the discipline has several problems, which demand the attention of those charged with the defense of the country and the reform of the intelligence community. B. Current issues in counterintelligence. 1. Two philosophies. December 1974 marked the end of an era in CIA counterintelligence. James Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence at the Central Intelligence Agency since 1954, retired over differences of opinion with Director William Colby on the proper approach to the practice of counterintelligence. The new regime proved to be considerably different in its approach to counterintelligence, emphasizing a diffusion of counterintelligence responsibilities. End of page 174, beginning page 175. Throughout the Operations Directorate. Presumably, this has led to an increased flow of counterintelligence information within the agency, but at the same time has raised questions concerning compartmentation and security. The new chief of CIA counterintelligence has instituted a series of specific changes which have been studied closely by the Select Committee. The findings are of an extremely sensitive character and have been reported to the Senate and to the President in a classified form. It should be noted here that the CIA counterintelligence is now emphasizing different factors than heretofore, which reflect somewhat different philosophy than that espoused by Angleton. These differences in viewpoint raise several important questions concerning how best to protect the United States, including the proper degree of compartmentation of counterintelligence information, methods of operation, approaches to security, research priorities, extent of liaison cooperation, and emphasis on deception activities, among other things. A high-level executive branch review of the classified issues which have surfaced in this disagreement is of considerable importance. Included in this review should be an examination of the approval process for certain counter-espionage operations. 2. Interagency relations. Equally as troubling as these issues is the problem of CIA/counterintelligence relations with other counterintelligence units in the government. Particularly vexing have been the on-again, off-again liaison ties between the agency and the FBI. Footnote 28. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 28. Former FBI liaison person with CIA, staff summary, August 22nd, 75. Resuming the reading. This history has been marked by turbulence, though a strong undercurrent of cooperation has usually existed at the staff level since 1952, when the Bureau began sending a liaison man to the CIA on a regular basis. The sources of friction between the CIA and FBI in the early days revolved around such matters as the frequent unwillingness of the Bureau to assist the CIA within the United States or to help recruit foreign officials in this country. Pressure from the CIA on the Bureau to increase microphone coverage of foreign targets within the United States was also a, quote, red flag, end quote, to Hoover. Footnote 29. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 29. IBID. Resuming the reading. A series of disagreements punctuated the relations between the two agencies throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Several flaps arose, for example, when the CIA Domestic Operations Division attempted to recruit foreign officials within the United States and failed to advise the Bureau. Footnote 30. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 30. IBID. Resuming the reading. In 1966, an informal agreement was negotiated between the FBI and the CIA to regularize their, quote, coordination, end quote. This agreement had its, quote, heart, end quote, that the CIA would, quote, seek concurrence and coordination of the FBI, end quote, before engaging in clandestine activity in the United States, and that the FBI would, quote, concur and coordinate if the proposed action does not conflict with any operation, current or planned, including active investigation, in brackets, by, in brackets, the FBI, end quote. Moreover, When an agent recruited by the CIA abroad arrived in the United States, the FBI would, quote, be advised, end quote, and the two agencies would, quote, confer regarding the handling. End of page 175, beginning page 176. Of the agent in the United States, end quote. The CIA could, quote, continue, end quote, its, quote, handling, end quote, of the agent for, quote, in foreign intelligence, end quote, purposes. And the FBI would also become involved where there were, quote, internal security factors, end quote, although it was recognized that CIA might continue to, quote, handle, end quote, the agent in the United States and provide the Bureau with, quote, information, end quote, bearing on, quote, internal security matters, end quote, footnote 30A. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 30A. Testimony of former FBI liaison person with CIA, September 22nd, 75, pages 52 to 55. Resuming the reading. Eventually, the much heralded, though actually minor, Riha incident in 1970 became, quote, the straw that broke the camel's back, end quote. Footnote 31. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 31. James Angleton testimony, September 24, 75. Hearings, pages 657 to 58. Resuming the reading. Hoover ordered the discontinuation of FBI liaison with the Central Intelligence Agency, though informal means of communication continued between the CIA and FBI staff personnel. Hoover's decision was a setback to the coordination of counterintelligence in the government. Not until Hoover was gone from the Bureau did formal liaison relations begin to improve. Footnote 32. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 32. Scott Miller testimony, the Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, March 1975, page 938. Resuming the reading. Today, most counterintelligence officers in both agencies say that coordination and communication linkages are good, though a recent retired CIA/counterintelligence officer points to, quote, a vital need for closer integration of the counterintelligence efforts of the CIA and the FBI, end quote. Footnote 33. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 33. Statement from Scott Miller to the Senate Select Committee, January 28, 76, pages 32 to 33. Resuming the reading. The most salient criticisms of FBI counterintelligence voiced at the CIA concern 1. The lack of sufficient counterintelligence manpower in the FBI. 2. Occasional disputes over the bona fides of defectors. And 3. Differences of opinion on the possibility of hostile penetrations within the government. Each of these matters also requires immediate review by the executive branch. In particular, the occasional interagency disputes over de facto bona fides and differences of opinion on suspected hostile penetrations cry out for a higher level of authority in the executive branch to settle these sometimes divisive disagreements. 3. The scope and basis of FBI counterintelligence. In the imperfect contemporary world where other nations have interests which conflict with those of the United States, foreign directed clandestine intelligence activities in this country must be of constant concern to the American people. One of the original reasons for the FBI's domestic intelligence mission was that the United States needed, in the late 1930s, a coordinated program for investigating, quote, persons engaged in espionage, counter-espionage, or sabotage, end quote. Footnote 34. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 34. Memorandum from J. Edgar Hoover to Attorney General Murphy, March 1639. Resuming the reading. By mid-1939, the FBI and military intelligence had gathered a, quote, reservoir of information concerning foreign agencies operating in the United States, end quote, with efficient, quote, channels for the exchange of information, end quote. Footnote 35. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 35. Letter from Attorney General Murphy to President Roosevelt, June 1739. Resuming the reading. There is no question that during this pre-war period, foreign espionage constituted a serious threat to the security of the United States, and thus supported the basic decision to conduct investigations of activities which were, quote, not within the specific provisions of prevailing statutes, end quote. Footnote 36. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 36. Memorandum from Hoover to Murphy, March 1639. End of page 176, beginning page 177. But which involved, quote, potential, end quote, espionage, counter-espionage, or sabotage. Footnote 37. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 37. Directive of President Roosevelt, June 26, 39. While the FBI's responsibilities were also described at times as extending to, quote, subversion, end quote, and the lack of outside guidance allowed for overly broad FBI investigations, the problem of spying was always paramount. See the orders of President Roosevelt and Attorney General Biddle regarding warrantless wiretappings, discussed in report on warrantless FBI electronic surveillance. Resuming the reading. One of the major difficulties in any attempt to base investigations of foreign espionage on criminal statutes has been, from the outset, the restricted and sometimes contradictory scope of the laws, and a recent legal analysis that has observed that, quote, the legislation in many ways incomprehensible, end quote. Footnote 38. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 38. Harold Edgar and Benno C. Schmidt, quote, the espionage statutes and publication of defense information, end quote. Columbia Law Review, Volume 53, May 1973, pages 929 and 934. Resuming the reading. Most notably, the espionage statutes do not make it a crime simply to engage in the knowing and unauthorized transfer of classified information to foreign agents. Footnote 39. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 39. IBID, page 1084. Resuming the reading. Moreover, the statutes do not extend to a range of privately held information, especially on scientific and technical matters which would be valuable to a foreign power. Hostile and foreign intelligence activities include more than just a looking for classified information or espionage results. Information of a highly technical and strategic nature, though unclassified, which is normally restricted or unavailable in other societies, is openly procurable in the United States through academic institutions, trade associations, and government offices. Intelligence officers may seek out persons who have defected to the United States to induce them to re-defect back to their home country. Footnote 40. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 40. FBI memorandum, quote, intelligence activities within the United States by foreign governments, end quote, March 20th, 75. Resuming the reading. Foreign intelligence targets in this country may include information possessed by third nations and their representatives in the United States. Moreover, this type of activity, which is most easy to detect and which may indicate possible espionage, does not always satisfy the normal standard of, quote, reasonable suspicion, end quote. As a study prepared by the Fund for the Republic stated 20 years ago, the problem of crime detection in combating espionage are not ordinary ones. Espionage is a crime which succeeds only by secrecy. Moreover, spies work not for themselves or privately organized crime, quote, syndicates, end quote, but as agents of national states. Their activities are therefore likely to be carefully planned, highly organized, and carried on by techniques skillfully designed to prevent detection. End quote. Footnote 41. Reading footnote 41. Fund for the Republic, Digest of the Public Record of Consumerism in the United States. New York, 1955, page 29. Resuming the reading. Consequently, espionage investigations must be initiated on the basis of fragments of information, especially where they may be only an indication of suspicious contact with a foreign agent and limited data as to specific purposes of the contact. In addition, prosecution is frequently not the objective of an espionage investigation. For one thing, the government may desire, quote, to, end of page 177, beginning page 178, avoid exposing its own counter-espionage practices and information, end quote. Footnote 42. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 42. IBID. Resuming the reading. In addition, the purpose of the investigation may be to find out what a known foreign agent is looking for, both as an indication of the espionage interest of the foreign country and as a means of ensuring that the agent is not on the track of vital information. Since foreign agents are replaceable, it may be a better defense not to expel them from their country or otherwise halt their activities, but rather to maintain a constant watch on their operations. This also means investigating in a more limited fashion many of the Americans with whom the foreign agent associates, in order to determine what the agent may be interested in learning from them. In the 1930s and 1940s, another argument for going beyond the criminal statutes was that there was significant ideological and nationality factors which motivated persons to engage in espionage. As Attorney General Jackson puts it in 1940, Individuals were a, quote, likely source, end quote, of law violation because they were, quote, sympathetic with the systems or design of foreign dictators, end quote. Footnote 43. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 43. Proceedings of the Federal State Conference on Law Enforcement Problems of National Defense, August 5th through 6th, 40. Resuming the reading. The 1946 report of the Canadian Royal Commission made similar findings. This was the most persuasive rationale for constituting FBI investigations of communists and fascists, as well as Germans and other nationality groups before World War II. It continued to be a substantial basis for such investigations of communists after the war. Footnote 44. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 44. A characteristic of most of the cases in which espionage for the Soviet Union has been prosecuted is that the participants seem to have been motivated by ideology, end quote. Fund for the Republic, Digest of the Public Record of Communism in the United States, page 29. Resuming the reading. By the mid-1950s, however, the characteristics of foreign espionage had changed substantially. The decline of the Communist Party caused a shrinkage in possible recruits, with the result that Soviet intelligence reverted, quote, more and more to the old type of conventional spy, end quote. Footnote 45. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 45. Alexander Dallin, Soviet Espionage, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1955, page 510. This authoritative study of communist espionage added that, quote, the traditional type of non-political spy has advantages over a communist. His past evokes no suspicion, end quote. Resuming the reading. A report prepared by the Association of the Bar of the City of New York observed that it was, quote, vital, end quote, to adjust the government's security program to, quote, new conditions, end quote, one of which was the, quote, decline of the appeal of communism, end quote. The report added, in 1930s and 1940s, the Soviet Union could rely on the support of a small but substantial group in this country who were sympathetic with its asserted aims. Now, this has largely changed. This has made a radical change in the type and number of persons who might be lured into communist espionage. Footnote 46. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 46. Report of the Special Committee on the Federal Loyalty Security Program of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. New York, Dodd, Mead, Co. 1956, page 35 to 36. The FBI itself believed that the Communist Party had become a, quote, potential, end quote, rather than the actual espionage danger. Footnote 47. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 47. FBI monograph, quote, "The Communist Menace in the United States Today," end quote, 1955, pages 4 through 5. Resuming the reading. While that, end of page 178, beginning page 179, potential threat was still significant in the view of the party's subservience to the Soviet Union, the counter-espionage justification for sweeping investigations of persons one or two steps removed from the party, example, quote, "sympathizers," end quote, or, quote, "infiltrated," end quote, groups, lost much of its force. Nevertheless, there continued to be hostile foreign intelligence activities which the FBI characterizes as, quote, "efforts to penetrate the American political system," end quote, or attempts, quote, "to develop an agent of influence in American politics," end quote, or efforts, quote, "to influence the U.S. policy-making structure," end quote, footnote 48. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 48. FBI memorandum, quote, "intelligence activities within the United States by foreign governments," end quote, March 2075. Resuming the reading. Therefore, the monitoring of contacts between U.S. government officials and foreign officials who are likely to be carrying out the directions of a hostile foreign intelligence service is a necessary part of the FBI's investigative duties. The subject of investigation is the foreign official, and any inquiry directed toward the American official can be limited to determining the nature of the foreign official's interests. Frequently, it is desirable that the American official be informed by the Bureau, especially when the contact is overt rather than furtive or clandestine. The same is also true with respect to overt contacts with American private citizens. Footnote 49. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 49. Contacts made secretly or with the apparent intent to avoid detection justify more extensive investigation. Resuming the reading. There are two areas of special difficulty in prescribing the FBI's proper responsibility. The first involves contacts between members of Congress or high-level executive officials, and equally high-level foreign officials. There have been instances where the FBI has had reason to believe that such contacts might involve the unauthorized disclosure of confidential information to a foreign government. Except in such rare circumstances, however, contacts of this nature need not be the subject of FBI investigation or dissemination. Footnote 50. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 50. Where the FBI discovers such contacts as a byproduct of its investigations for other purposes, they can be noted without reference to the identity of U.S. official in order to compile a quantitative measure of foreign activity. Resuming the reading. The second difficulty involves the concept, quote, "foreign subversion," end quote, used most recently in President Ford's executive order defining the counterintelligence duties of the U.S. intelligence community, including the FBI. Footnote 51. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 51. Executive Order 11905, quote, "United States Foreign Intelligence Activities," end quote. Section 2A2, Section 4B4, Section 4G1, February 18th, 76. Resuming the reading. As noted above, the Bureau characterizes certain hostile foreign intelligence activities as attempts to develop, quote, "agents of influence in American politics," end quote. The FBI considered one of Dr. Martin Luther King's advisors to be such an, quote, agent of influence, end quote. In this case, as with the massive investigations to uncover possible foreign, quote, influence, end quote, on domestic protest activities, the concern for, quote, foreign subversion, end quote, was distorted so far beyond reasonable definition that the term, quote, subversion, end quote, should be abandoned completely. Even with the qualifier, quote, foreign, end quote, the concept is so elastic as to be susceptible to future misuse. Nevertheless, there remains a compelling need to investigate all the activities of hostile foreign intelligence services, including their efforts to recruit, quote, agents of influence, end quote. This can be accomplished by continuing investigation of the foreign agents themselves, where a foreign, end of page 179, beginning page 180, agent makes an overt contact with an American. A limited inquiry regarding the American is appropriate to determine the nature of the foreign agent's interests. This applies whether the agent's interest is information or, quote, influence, end quote, and the Bureau can frequently make its inquiry known to the American. But the Bureau's objectives should be confined solely to learning more about the overall mission of the hostile service and the particular assignments of its officers, as opposed to investigating, quote, influence, end quote, by foreign officials or agents who do not have intelligence duties and the lawful activities of Americans who are not foreign agents. There is no compelling reason for intensive investigations of U.S. officials or private citizens, simply because they are targets of foreign, quote, influence, end quote. The line must be tightly drawn so that FBI counterintelligence investigations do not themselves once again intrude into American political process, with consequences damaging not only to the rights of Americans, but also to public confidence in the Bureau. Citizen cooperation with the FBI is essential to its success in detecting and countering the threat of hostile foreign intelligence operations to the defense of the nation. To achieve this end, the federal criminal statutes dealing with espionage should be substantially revised to take account of the contemporary counterintelligence responsibilities of the FBI. A realistic definition of foreign-directed clandestine intelligence activity would make it possible for the FBI to base its counterintelligence investigations on the firm foundation of the criminal law, rather than the shifting interpretations of terms like, quote, subversion, end quote, in executive orders. The committee agrees with Attorney General Edward H. Levi that the fact that the FBI has criminal investigative responsibilities, which must be conducted within the confines of constitutional protections strictly enforced by the courts, gives the organization an awareness of the interests of individual liberties that might be missing in an agency devoted solely to intelligence work. Footnote 52. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 52. Levi testimony, December 10th, 75. Hearings, Volume 6, pages 314 to 315. Resuming the reading. C. Conclusions. 1. A subcommittee on counterintelligence should be established within the framework of the National Security Council, NSC. Its purpose would be to monitor counterintelligence activities, authorize important counter-espionage operations, and adjudicate interagency disagreements over counterintelligence policies, coordination, defector bona fides, suspected hostile penetrations, and related matters. 2. The President of the United States, in consultation with the Oversight Committee of Congress, should undertake a top-secret review of current issues in the realm of counterintelligence. This review, which should form the basis for an internal presidential statement on national counterintelligence policy and objectives, should include close attention to the following issues: compartmentation, operations, security, research, accountability, training, internal review, deception, liaison, and coordination, and manpower. 3. Congressional oversight should devote more attention to this. End of page 180, beginning page 181. Area: to help preserve the liberties of American citizens and to prod the intelligence community toward a more effective defense of the nation. Additional recommendations on counterintelligence, including reform of the espionage laws and legislation setting standards for activities affecting the rights of Americans, are made in the committee's report on intelligence activities and the rights of Americans. End of page 181, beginning page 182. 10. The domestic impact of foreign clandestine operations. The CIA and academic institutions, the media, and religious institutions. Although its operational arena is outside the United States, CIA clandestine operations make use of American citizens as individuals or through American institutions. Clandestine activities that touch American institutions and individuals have taken many forms and are affected through a wide variety of means. University officials and professors provide leads and make introductions for intelligence purposes. Footnote 1. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 1. The material italicized in this report has been substantially abridged at the request of the executive agencies. The classified version of this material is available to members of the Senate under the provisions of Senate Resolution 21 and the standing rules of the Senate. See also page 9. Resuming the reading. Scholars and journalists collect intelligence. Journalists devise and place propaganda. United States publications provide cover for CIA agents overseas. These forms of clandestine cooperation had their origins in the early Cold War period, when most Americans perceived a real threat of a communist imperium and were prepared to assist their government to counter the threat. As the communist pressed to influence and to control international organizations and movements, mass communications, and cultural institutions, the United States responded by involving American private institutions and individuals in the secret struggle over minds, institutions, and ideas. Over time, national perceptions would change as to the nature and seriousness of the communist ideology and institutional threat. Time and experience would also give increasing currency to doubts as to whether it made sense for a democracy to resort to practices such as the clandestine use of free American institutions and individuals, practices that tended to blur the very difference between our system and, quote, theirs, end quote. that these covert programs were designed to preserve. These covert relationships have attracted public concern and the attention of this committee because of the importance Americans attach to the independence of private institutions. Americans recognize that insofar as universities, newspapers, and religious groups help mold the beliefs of the public and the policymakers, their diversity and legitimacy must be rigorously protected. It is through them that a society informs and criticizes itself, educates its young, interprets its history, and sets new goals. At the same time, Americans also recognize the legitimacy and necessity of certain clandestine operations, particularly the collection of foreign intelligence, to conclude that certain sectors of American life must be placed, quote, off limits, end quote, to clandestine operations, inevitably raise questions not only on possible intelligence losses, which would result from such a prohibition, but on whether the United States can. End of page 182, beginning page 183. Afford to forego a clandestine use of our universities, our media, and our religious groups in competing with our adversaries. In exploring this problem, the committee has given special attention to the CIA's past clandestine relationships with American institutions. The committee has examined the past to illuminate the attitudes and perceptions that shape these clandestine programs using American institutions, and to determine whether the internal CIA regulations established in 1967 are sufficient to prevent the large-scale programs of the past from being reinstated in the future. Some of these concerns were addressed almost a decade ago during an investigation that proved to be a watershed in the Central Intelligence Agency's relationship to American institutions. President Lyndon Johnson, moved by the public and congressional uproar over the 1967 disclosure of the CIA's covert funding of the National Student Association, NSA, and other domestic private institutions, established the Katzenbach Committee. The committee, chaired by the then Under Secretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach, directed its investigation primarily at the CIA's covert funding of American educational and private voluntary organizations. The recommendations of the Katzenbach Committee, although they had great impact on the CIA's operations, spoke only to the issue of the covert funding of institutions. In its investigation, the committee has looked not only at the impact of foreign clandestine operations on American institutions, but has focused particular attention on the covert use of individuals. It should be emphasized from the outset that the integrity of these institutions or individuals is not jeopardized by open contact or cooperation with government intelligence institutions. United States government support and cooperation, openly acknowledged, plays an essential role in American education. Equally important, American policymakers draw on the technical expertise and advice available from academic consultants and university-related research organizations. Once open and regular contact with government agencies, open and regular contact with government agencies is a necessary part of the journalist's responsibility as well. A secret or covert relationship with any of these institutions, however, is another matter and requires careful evaluation, given the critical role these institutions play in maintaining the freedom of our society. In approaching this subject, the committee has inquired are the independence and integrity of American institutions in any way endangered by the relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency? Should clandestine use of institutions or individuals within those institutions be permitted? If not, there should be explicit guidelines laid down to regulate government clandestine support or operational use of such institutions or individuals. Should such guidelines be in the form of executive directives or by statute? In addressing these issues, the committee's access to CIA documents and files varied with the subject matter. In reviewing the clandestine activities that preceded the Katzenbach Committee inquiry of 1967, the Select Committee had full and unfettered access to most files and documentation, with the single exception of records on media relationships. The committee took extensive sworn testimony from all of those involved in the management and review of the pre-1967 projects. Access to post-1967 material was far more restricted. End of page 183, beginning page 184. Certain of the titles and names of authors of propaganda books published after 1967 were denied the committee. Access to files on the contemporary clandestine use of American academic community was restricted to information which would provide the numbers of institutions and individuals involved, and a description of the roles of the individuals. As for the media and relationships with religious groups, the committee inspected precise or summaries of all operational relationships since 1951, and then selected over 20 cases for closer inspection. The documents from these some 20 files were selected and screened by the agency, and, by mutual agreement, names of individuals and institutions were removed. Therefore, the committee has far from the full picture of the nature and extent of these relationships and the domestic impact of foreign clandestine operations. Nevertheless, it has enough to outline the dimensions of the problem and to underscore its serious nature. The conclusions and recommendations must necessarily be considered tentative and subject to careful review by the successor intelligence oversight committees of the Congress. In presenting the facts and issues associated with CIA covert relations with United States private institutions, this report is organized as follows. 1. Covert use of academic and voluntary organizations. 2. Covert relationships with the United States media. 3. Covert use of United States religious groups. A. Covert use of academic and voluntary organizations. The Central Intelligence Agency has long developed clandestine relationships with the American academic community, which range from academics making introductions for intelligence purposes, footnote 2, to intelligence collection while abroad, to academic research and writing where CIA sponsorship is hidden. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 2. For explanation of italics, see footnote, page 179. Resuming the reading. The agency has funded activities of American private organizations around the world when those activities supported or could be convinced to support American foreign policy objectives. Until 1967, the agency also maintained covert ties to American foundations in order to pass funds secretly to private groups whose work the CIA supported. The relationships have varied according to whether made with an institution or an individual, whether the relationship is paid or unpaid, or whether the individuals are, quote, witting, end quote, i.e., aware of CIA involvement. In some cases, covert involvement provided the CIA with little or no operational control of the institutions involved. Funding was primarily a way to enable people to do things they wanted to do. In other cases, influence was exerted. Nor was the nature of these relationships necessarily static. In the case of some individuals, support turned into influence, and finally, even to operational use. During the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA turned increasingly to covert action in the area of student and labor matters, cultural affairs, and community developments. The struggle with communism was seen to be, at center, a struggle between our institutions and theirs. The CIA subsidized, advised, and even helped develop, quote, private, quote, organizations that would compete with the communists around the world. Some of end of page 184, beginning page 185. These organizations were foreign, others were international, yet others were U.S.-based student, labor, cultural, or philanthropic organizations whose internal activities the CIA subsidized. And I'm going to end this recording here.